29 feet. That is the gap between the surface of Lake Powell this month and the elevation where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer turn water into electricity. Not Deadpool. Just the line where the turbines shut down and every drop Arizona is legally owed has to find another way through a wall of concrete in the northern corner of the state. Below that line, the entire lower Colorado River runs through 4 steel pipes that federal engineers have already found chewed up from the inside. And on August 21st, 3 days ago, the Secretary of the Interior signed a document that cuts Arizona's water by 760,000 acre-feet a year. That is more than triple what California gives up. It is 15 times what Nevada gives up. 6 million people in central Arizona live downstream of that signature, along with the farms, the tribes, the copper mines, and the semiconductor plants that the state has spent 40 years building on top of a promise. So how does the state that engineered its way out of the desert end up first in line when the water runs short? Start with the canal, because Arizona's water problem is really a delivery problem before it is a supply problem. The Central Arizona Project is a concrete river. It begins at Lake Havasu on the Colorado, and it carries water 336 miles uphill across the Sonoran Desert to Phoenix and Tucson, lifting at nearly 3,000 vertical feet with 14 pumping plants along the way. It cost roughly $4 billion. It is the single largest and most expensive water transfer system ever built in the United States, and from the air it looks exactly like what it is, a blue thread stitched through brown rock and saguaro, running dead straight for miles, with the desert pressing in on both sides. That canal is why Phoenix exists at its current size. It is also why Arizona is exposed. When Congress authorized the project in 1968, California would not agree to it unless Arizona accepted something in writing. In a shortage, the Central Arizona Project gets cut first. Arizona took the deal because a junior right to water was better than no water at all. Nearly 60 years later, that single clause is the reason a drought in the Rocky Mountains lands harder in Maricopa County than it does in Los Angeles. For a long time, that clause was theory. It stopped being theory in 2022 when the first federal shortage on the Colorado River was declared and Arizona gave up 512,000 acre-feet, about 18% of its entire river supply. Inside the canal system, water moves by priority. Tribal nations sit at the top. Cities come next. The agricultural pool sits at the bottom. So the cut did not spread evenly. The agricultural pool lost 65% of its allocation in 2022. In 2023, it was cut to zero. It stayed at zero in 2024. Roughly 200 farms across Pinal County, a stretch of cotton, alfalfa, and dairy country between Phoenix and Tucson, went back to pumping groundwater and left as much as 40% of their fields unplanted. Fields that were green in satellite images one spring were bare dirt the next. University of Arizona researchers compared 2 neighboring irrigation districts using high-resolution satellite imagery, one holding junior rights and one holding senior tribal rights, and the difference was visible from orbit. Adjacent land, identical climate, opposite outcomes, decided entirely by a line in a 1968 statute. The tribal pool, by contrast, took no cut at all in 2022, and reductions of only 6 to 7% in the 2 years that followed. That is not an accident. It is the priority system doing exactly what it was written to do, and it is a preview of how the next round of cuts will land. That was the warm-up. What happened this month is the real event, and to understand it, you have to look at the numbers coming out of the Bureau of Reclamation over the past 3 weeks. On August 7th, Lake Mead fell to an elevation of 1,050 feet above sea level. That broke the record low set on July 28, 2022, by a matter of inches. The next day, it read 1,040.34. By August 20th, it had fallen to 1,039.44 feet, with roughly 6.9 million acre-feet in storage against a capacity of about 26 million. The reservoir is holding a little over a quarter of what it was built to hold. It has not been full since July of 1983. The Bureau's own 24-month study projects Lake Mead ending this calendar year near 1,037 feet, and the trend line does not flatten out after that. There is a second number sitting just below that one. Hoover Dam, which forms Lake Mead on the Arizona and Nevada border, runs 17 main turbines rated at about 2,080 megawatts when the reservoir is near full. At 1,035 feet, 12 of those 17 have to be taken offline because the pressure driving them drops low enough that vapor bubbles form inside the housings and hammer the blades apart. Only 5 rebuilt Whitehead units, installed in the mid-2010s, can keep running below that point, and together they produce roughly 382 megawatts. That is a cut of about 70% from the dam's designed output. The lake is currently about 4.5 feet above that line. 300 miles upstream, Lake Powell is in worse condition. The August study projects the reservoir finishing the water year near 3,516 feet with about 5 million acre-feet in storage, roughly 22% of capacity. Minimum power pool at Glen Canyon Dam is 3,490 feet. Dead pool is 3370 ud. Reclamation's most probable forecast puts Powell crossing the power pool line around spring of 2027. Put the two reservoirs together and you get the statistic that Interior itself used in its August 21st announcement. Combined storage in Lake Mead and Lake Powell has not been this low since before Lake Powell began filling behind Glen Canyon Dam in 1963. 63 years of stored water spent. The cause is not one bad winter, though the winter of 2025 to 2026 delivered the lowest observed snowpack in the basin's record. It is 26 consecutive years of drought in a basin where the paper promises were written during an unusually wet stretch in the early 20th century. The 1922 Compact and the 1944 treaty with Mexico together commit about 16.5 million acre-feet a year. The river in this century has averaged closer to 12. The arithmetic has been wrong for 104 years, and Lake Mead and Lake Powell were the savings account that hit it. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. We cover water systems, infrastructure, and geography stories like this as they develop, with the full picture you need to actually follow what is going on. Now here is the part of Arizona's crisis that almost nobody outside the engineering world talks about, and it is the reason those 29 feet at Lake Powell matter more than the number alone suggests. Glen Canyon Dam was finished in 1963 and sits on the Colorado just above the Grand Canyon near Page, Arizona. It is 710 feet tall. Its 8 generators are rated at roughly 1,320 megawatts, and that power runs through a federal transmission system that supplies rural cooperatives and tribal utilities across 6 states, including some of the most remote communities in northern Arizona. Water normally leaves the dam through the penstocks, the intakes that feed the turbines. Those intakes are set high in the structure. When the reservoir surface drops below 3,490 feet, they cannot draw reliably. The generators come offline, and the only remaining path for water is the river outlet works, 2 intakes on the upstream face feeding 4 steel pipes, each 96 inches across, with a combined rated capacity of about 15,000 cubic feet per second. Those pipes were never designed to be the main channel of the Colorado River. They were built to dump excess water during floods, and the last real flood on this river was in 1983. For most of the dam's life, they have sat mostly unused. In April of 2023, Reclamation ran a high-flow experiment pushing roughly 3,500 cubic feet per second through the outlet works for 72 hours to move sediment down into the Grand Canyon. When inspectors went inside afterward, they found cavitation damage. Cavitation happens when water moving fast enough drops in pressure until vapor bubbles form, and those bubbles collapse against the steel with enough force to tear the coating and pit the metal. It is the same process that eats turbine blades. Similar damage was first noted in these pipes in 1965, 2 years after the dam opened. Reclamation scheduled roughly $9 million in relining and valve work. Read that sequence carefully, because it is the whole problem in one paragraph. 3,500 cubic feet per second, less than a quarter of the pipe's rated capacity for 3 days, and the steel came back damaged. Under a dead pool scenario, the same pipes would be expected to carry the river continuously for months or years. A Reclamation technical memo in 2024 warned that the outlet works should not be relied on as the sole means of sustained water delivery, and the agency issued guidance for reducing flows through them if Powell drops below 3,550 feet. Reclamation has since said it wants to keep the reservoir above 3,500 feet specifically to avoid finding out. The people downstream understand exactly what that means. Patrick Dent, who handles water policy for the Central Arizona Project, has said the agency does not care which fix is chosen so long as the dam can release water at a lower lake level. Governor Stephen Roe Lewis of the Gila River Indian community, whose people hold some of the oldest and strongest water rights on the system and receive their water through the same canal, wrote to Reclamation in March, saying flatly that the federal government must fix Glen Canyon Dam. Eric Balkin of the Glen Canyon Institute and Zach Frankel of the Utah Rivers Council have argued for years that the answer is new bypass tunnels drilled around the dam at river level. That work would take more than a decade, and no one has funded it. So Arizona's position is this. It holds the junior right in the lower basin. It depends on a 336-mile canal that runs at the bottom of the priority list, and the dam that stores its upstream supply has plumbing that engineers are not confident can deliver the river if the reservoir keeps falling. That is the box the state was in when the federal deadline arrived. Which brings us to what actually happened on August 21st. The rules that have governed Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the 2007 interim guidelines, and the drought agreements layered on top of them expire at the end of this year. Reclamation started the replacement process in June of 2023. 3 years, 6 alternatives, more than 18,000 public comments, and the 7 basin states never reached consensus. They missed a preliminary deadline in November of 2025 and a final one in February of 2026. The upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, held the position that they use only about 4.5 million acre-feet against a paper share of 7.5, and that they cannot be ordered to cut water the mountains never delivered. The lower basin states argued that the reservoirs sit on their side of the line and the shortages land on their users. With no agreement, the federal government wrote the rules. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum signed the Record of Decision and the 2027 to 2028 operating guidelines on August 21st. New operations take effect October 1st. The structure is a 10-year decision framework running through 2036, but it does not set a decade of numbers. It sets boundaries and then issues guidelines in 2-year intervals, which means the states will be back at this table again and again. For the first 2 years, the lower basin must reduce deliveries by a combined 1.25 million acre-feet annually. Arizona absorbs 760,000. California absorbs 440,000. Nevada absorbs 50,000. On top of that, lower basin contractors have to conserve at least 700,000 acre-feet of additional system water in Lake Mead across 2026, 2027, and 2028. At Lake Powell, the August study puts the October 1st starting elevation below 3,540 feet, which places the reservoir in what the new guidelines call the Low Elevation Infrastructure Protection Range, with an expected water year release between 6 and 7 million acre-feet. That phrase is worth sitting with. The federal government has now written a formal operating tier whose stated purpose is protecting the infrastructure itself rather than the water supply. Arizona's own officials called the outcome a partial win, and by the numbers they have a case. Governor Katie Hobbs's office noted that without the deal Arizona, California, and Nevada struck in May, the federal framework left room for reductions of up to 77% to Central Arizona project supplies in 2027 and 2028. Representative Greg Stanton said the state held firm on its legal rights and welcomed 2 years of certainty, then added the part that matters more. A 2-year reprieve is not a solution, and the threat of the canal going to zero will now return every 2 years. He is describing something real in the fine print. For 2027 and 2028, shortages up to 1.5 million acre-feet get split using the formula the 3 lower basin states proposed in May, under which Arizona takes 80% of the first 300,000 acre-feet and 43.33% of the next tranche. From 2029 onward, unless new agreements are reached, allocation reverts to the priority system, and under the priority system, junior rights created after 1968, which include most of the Central Arizona project, are cut before nearly everyone else. The negotiated cushion has an expiration date built into it. Meanwhile, the physical system keeps doing what it has been doing. In April, Reclamation released up to 1 million acre-feet from Flaming Gorge Reservoir on the Wyoming and Utah border, hundreds of miles upstream, to prop up Lake Powell. Jack Schmidt, the Utah State University researcher who has tracked this basin for decades, described the choice in the simplest possible terms. With a bathtub, you either open the faucet or you close the drain. The faucet is snowpack, and it did not run this year. So the agency closed the drain, cutting releases from Powell down to Mead by nearly 1.5 million acre-feet, which props up one reservoir by draining the other faster. That is the maneuver that pushed Lake Mead through its record low in August. The consequences of that maneuver do not stop at the shoreline. Colorado River hydropower is not sold the way city water is. It moves through a federal transmission network that was built to serve exactly the customers who have the fewest alternatives: rural electric cooperatives, small municipal utilities, and tribal utilities across the Southwest. When Glen Canyon and Hoover produce less, those customers do not simply lose power. They buy replacement electricity on the open market, typically from natural gas plants, often at 2 to 3 times the cost, and that difference shows up on household bills in places where household budgets are thinnest. Basin-wide, hydropower generation from the Colorado system has already fallen by roughly half since the drought began. The people absorbing that are not in Phoenix or Los Angeles. They are in the towns across the Navajo Nation, in the small rural districts of northern Arizona and eastern Nevada that were wired into these dams precisely because the power was supposed to be cheap and permanent. There is also the question of what Arizona has built while all of this was happening. The state now describes itself as the semiconductor capital of the country, with fabrication plants near Phoenix representing tens of billions of dollars in construction. Those facilities are not the largest water users in the state by volume. Agriculture still is, by a wide margin. But they are the newest, they are politically enormous, and they were cited on the assumption that central Arizona's water picture was settled. Data centers, which have expanded across the Phoenix metro area over the same period, carry the same assumption. Every one of those investments was made against a supply that is now issued 2 years at a time. And underneath all of it sits the groundwater, which is Arizona's real backstop and its quietest liability. When Pinal County farms lost their canal water, they went back to wells. Groundwater in central Arizona is not a renewable supply on any human timescale, and the state's own modeling has already shown that some rural basins cannot support the development permits requested against them. Every acre-foot the canal does not deliver is an acre-foot that either does not get used or gets pumped out of the ground. So here is where Arizona stands as of today. Lake Mead is at its lowest recorded elevation since it filled in the 1930s. Lake Powell sits roughly 29 feet above the point where Glen Canyon Dam stops generating, with federal forecasts pointing at spring of 2027. The 4 pipes that would have to carry the river below that point were damaged by 72 hours of moderate use and have never been tested for sustained duty. Arizona has agreed to give up 760,000 acre-feet a year for 2 years, the largest cut of any state. And in 2029, the protection expires, and the 1968 priority clause takes over, unless 7 states that have failed for 3 years suddenly succeed. New operations begin on October 1st. The next 2-year negotiation starts almost immediately after. Nobody involved describes the current arrangement as a fix. Interior called it certainty. Arizona's own delegation called it a reprieve. The Bureau's forecasters call it a range. The canal is still full this week. The pumps at Havasu are still lifting water 3,000 feet uphill into the desert. And 300 miles north of Phoenix, the surface of Lake Powell is still falling toward a line drawn at 3,490 feet, where the turbines stop, the pipes take over, and the state of Arizona finds out whether 63-year-old plumbing can carry a river.